All right, good afternoon. Welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion. We're pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And now, with no further ado, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. We're going to do a slightly different format tonight. Usually we just talk about obviously the week that's passed and what we can look forward to. So we're going to widen it and talk a little bit about the year that's passed and what could happen in the year ahead in 2022. So as we know, this year has been a year of many unprecedented things in Israeli politics, but it started with an unprecedented another election after a relatively short-lived Gantz-Netanyahu government, which broke up in December 2020. It was a calculated move, as we all knew then, and we all certainly know now, by then Prime Minister Netanyahu to ensure that he wouldn't have to sit with Gantz for too long. And while he had an agreement that they would rotate the premiership, it was obviously not something that he ever intended to fulfill, and used the sort of escape hatch of the non-passing of a budget in December, which automatically called elections 3 months later. It was a calculated risk. At the time, it seemed like a good calculated risk because Netanyahu felt that he had enough to form a stable right-wing religious government after so many mishaps and so many attempts, so many elections. And in fact, really on paper, to a certain extent, he did. But, and we know now, in hindsight, the reality was very different because several, at least three right-wing parties decided not to go with Netanyahu and formed this really unprecedented government. We've had unity governments in the past. We've had a few different ones, but usually it revolved around two major parties, one from the center-left, one from the center-right, usually Labour, Likud, historically. We've also had with Kadima and Likud and others, but this one we saw just a large amount of parties with no one party really having a large amount of seats, and really, truly unprecedented. We had a prime minister with 6 seats. We have a rotation agreement, and we know now we have parties from the right to the left, and for the first time in Israel's history, we have an Arab party, not just an Arab party, but an Islamist party. Obviously, the Ram party of Mansour Abbas. It's really unprecedented that a party like that should sit in the government, and we've heard really unprecedented things from an Arab Israeli leader. Only last week at the Globes conference, Mansour Abbas recognized and talked about the legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish state. Now, that's completely unprecedented. Yes, there are Arab parties who have worked with the government to secure their needs, to service their communities, whatever it may be, but we've never had a significant Arab Israeli leader who's gone publicly. By the way, he said it in Arabic as well, and said that Israel was born as a Jewish state and it will continue to be that. We have to understand that reality. These were unprecedented words, and we've seen throughout the year that Mansour Abbas is not a flash in the pan, at least so far. He has really been a pretty considerate part of the coalition. He's understood the limits of his power with only, I think, 5 or 6 seats. And when it's come to it, he's able to, on the whole, keep his party in line, even though there is quite disparate amounts of views. We had, as I said, around the same time as Mansour Abbas was saying these unprecedented things about Israel as a Jewish state, we had another member of the party meeting with the recently released Sheikh Raed Salah from the banned Northern Islamic movement, which has been banned because it's for incitement and support for terror, some might say, certainly anti-Semitism. And here we had a Ram leader congratulate or be pictured alongside such a leader at the same time as the leader of the party was talking in a way, as I said, that we've never heard. Not wanting to already move on to the 2022 yet, but there are a lot of people who say that this could be the end of Ram. It could be that Mansour Abbas is leaning towards creating a new party, which will be built more in his image, and leave maybe Ram behind, leave some of the sort of the anti-Zionist sentiment, a strong anti-Zionist sentiment behind, perhaps. Again, this is something that we hear, but this government, many predicted it would fall because it was a party of such disparate parts with no one powerful leader. But we saw that they worked pretty well together. The leaders have really understood that it's in everyone's interest to work together. And there's been a lot of give and take, but they've managed to achieve things, not least the state budget that hadn't been passed for almost 3 years previously. And there was a lot of give and take. And in fact, they passed it well ahead of time, weeks ahead of time. And of course, there were always going to be some jockeying for position and for budgets. But at the end of the day, a lot of people take their hats off to Finance Minister Victor Lehman. He was able to really find a budget, which is not easy. We described in around that time how it's two different laws. There's arrangement laws and there's the budget law, which is the numbers. The arrangement laws is exactly what's going to be spent on. And it was a very, very long law and it had to be voted on, but it was passed. And that puts off any immediate threat. It put off, at least I should say, any immediate threat to this government for the foreseeable future. As I've said in previous weeks, there's no great threat at this moment to the coalition. In theory, they could not pass another law and fail to pass another law, I should say, for as long as they want until the next budget comes up. And there's no threat that the government will fall. The only real threats are if a budget doesn't pass, and this was a 2-year budget, so they don't have to worry about it for a while, or no confidence vote. And we talked before about the only party, ironically, especially how this year began, the only party that could possibly desert the coalition and go across and give Netanyahu the 8 seats he needs to form a coalition, because he has 53 at the moment, you need obviously 61, is Benny Gantz's party, the partner which he dumped on the wayside in his zeal to try and enhance his power. So there's a certain amount of irony in that. But as I said, this coalition doesn't seem to be in any immediate danger. There are disagreements, almost every day on the ideological front, not least with the visit yesterday of Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas to Benny Gantz, Defense Minister Benny Gantz's home. As you can imagine, the left greeted this, the right slammed it. But what is clear is that Prime Minister Bennett knew about it in advance. And, while he also will feel frustrated by it, it's not something he naturally seeks. It's, ideologically speaking, it's clear that he understands that he has to give a certain amount of leeway to each party in his coalition to seek their own, sort of noise. And what we're seeing is each government minister is able to, really look and see what they can be doing in their ministry. Under Netanyahu, Netanyahu was such a powerful leader that every minister who wanted to do something big within there, whether it's a reform, whether it's a big project, really had to pass it by Netanyahu. Not to say that Bennett won't be informed about these things in advance as the prime minister, but certainly the power structures in the Israeli government have been decentralized, partly because of the fact that we have a relatively weak prime minister, but also partly because that's what you have in a parliamentary system. And so one could argue we've actually gone back to its natural state. And it seems to be working. I've long stated that on the leadership level, there's a real understanding to make this work for as long as possible. But when you have a government or a coalition of 61, all you need is 1 or 2 votes and you don't have a majority anymore. A case in point is today's, there was supposed to be a vote on a reform of the conversion system, and the numbers were not looking great anyway. There were some members of Yamina who are more strict, and a lot of them who know that probably in the future they'll have to work in a government with the ultra-Orthodox, who sort of didn't necessarily want to see this, even though it was being promoted by the Minister of Religious Affairs, a member of Matan Kahana, a member of Yamina. But interesting enough, the Ram party dissented and said that they wouldn't vote for it. It seems, at least from the news, that you wonder why an Islamist party care about a law on Jewish conversion, where it seems the case was made by none other than Shas and the ultra-Orthodox parties, that the more conversions that take place, the more Jews there'll be in the country, which means that will upset the demographic balance. So it's quite extraordinary that ultra-Orthodox leaders, if this is true, and they made that clear openly, publicly on the news that this is the case they made, that they would want less Jews in the Jewish state. So there's still going to be a lot of barriers along the way, but certainly so far, this government seems to have some level of longevity. The big question that everyone asks, and I was in the Knesset earlier in the week, and certainly I asked everyone, as I frequently do, is do you think that the power sharing agreement between Lapid and Bennett will be fulfilled? Will Bennett hand over to Lapid in 2023, the prime ministership? My feeling has always been that Bennett himself will, but there are others who may not want that to happen, who may be jockeying for position and seeing what they can do to make sure that doesn't happen. Because, as I said, you don't just look at the current government, you have to look at the next elections. There's always what I call in Israeli politics that 2-year itch, where it used to be. These days, sometimes it could be 2-month itch, but it used to be 2 years of relative tranquility. And then, because everyone knows that Israeli governments don't last their full term, rarely even close to it. So usually around 3 years, election is held, sometimes less. So after 2 years, every party started to think, okay, what am I positioning myself for in the next elections? How can I entice my voters? How can I differentiate myself or my party from others around me, on the political map? So, that won't happen for a while. And that will happen as Lapid is supposed to become prime minister. So that could certainly become part of the calculations, and also whether parties feel that they've had enough successes and achievements to be able to go back to the voters. So that's really my feeling on the government. Across the aisle, the opposition, Netanyahu doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Today, there was a law passed, an interesting law. It's called it was given sometimes these so-called personnel laws, where laws were created specifically with someone in mind, are named after that person. So this law, not officially, of course, was called the Barkat law. What the Barkat law is, there's a politician in Likud called Nir Barkat. He was the mayor of Jerusalem, and he's probably the greatest threat to Netanyahu within the Likud. Most polls have him as second in the Likud and most likely to bring the most amount of seats if Netanyahu should resign or retire. And basically, Nir Barkat is also a multi-billionaire. He's one of the wealthiest people in Israel. And a lot of people in Likud, mostly led by Netanyahu, are afraid that he will use his money to unseat Netanyahu, to gain popularity. He's already held some very high-level events with, high-level catering and musicians and whatever. So there's certainly a certain amount of fear from the Netanyahu camp. And one of his, let's say, foot soldiers in the Knesset, Dudi Amsalem, put up this law which says that to limit the amount that someone can spend in primaries within parties, to 100,000 shekels, which is a pretty low amount. And that was blatantly with Barkat in mind. Interestingly enough, the coalition decided they didn't want the opposition to have this success. So what they did is they created Sharon Cheskel of New Hope, a member of their government, basically put up an identical law, and that passed through the first reading, and I'm sure it probably will pass through. So it shows that Netanyahu is nervous. His position isn't necessarily under threat at the moment, but there is a lot of disquiet in Likud, and you could see that by the amount of relatively high-profile people in Likud who voted against the law. You can also see it in the anger of some in Likud with Netanyahu's threat that any Likud member who doesn't come for a law, to the Knesset in time to vote on a law, they've been named and shamed, and there's a lot of anger about the way it's being treated. And don't forget, these are people who've been used to be ministers with what comes along with it. So while Netanyahu is not under threat at the moment, that could change in the months ahead. I wouldn't bet, I wouldn't put any money on it, but certainly that's a possibility. The big question, which everyone's asking at the end of 2021 and 2022, is Iran. What's going to happen with Iran? Will Israel attack Iran? Will Israel take measures against Iran? And basically, a lot of it depends on what happens in Vienna. As we've been told time and time again in recent days and recent weeks, this is the so-called last chance for Iran. The Americans have said it, the Brits have said it, the French have said it. And so far, the Iranians have not come with any serious intentions, despite the Chinese and the Russians trying to play up the Iranian side of things. But it does seem that there is, quite a lot of room. The Americans in the West seem to have a lot of patience for this. They do want a deal. The moment that there's a deal on the table, it means that Israel's opportunity to act becomes much, much smaller. As we know, during the JCPOA years before former President Trump removed the US from it, Israel did not take any major steps against Iran because it didn't want to be seen as destroying the agreement. As soon as President Trump withdrew American support for the JCPOA, Israel's operations and actions really were ramped up. And Israel is certainly trying to make its presence felt in Vienna. It's saying that the Iranian, less for less is not a good idea. That's what some people are talking about. And they certainly wouldn't be happy with what is being talked about as a possible deal. But at the moment, there is nothing concrete on the table. But it does seem like at some point there will be something. And when that happens, if the Americans sign up, which I'm sure they will, that obviously limits Israel's room for maneuver, despite what Prime Minister Bennett will say, that Israel retains the right to act even if there is an agreement. The reality is probably that will restrict them heavily unless there is some great maneuver towards nuclear weaponization. What Israel will probably do is return to the position that it had during the JCPOA, where it will increase intelligence to show to the West that Iran is not keeping its end of the deal. But probably on the, especially if Iran is keeping somewhat to the deal, Israel's room for maneuver will be much, much smaller. So those are some of the issues. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about those for any questions or any other issue which I haven't raised.
All right, thank you so much. The first question in is from Jeffrey Sheff. It has been written that the reason the coalition still exists is that none of the party leaders can see a political future for themselves outside the current coalition. Do you agree?
Yes and no. First of all, Israeli politics is fascinating, can throw up so many surprises. I mean, this year, as I said, we've had unprecedented surprises, but there's always surprises. So, you take a party like Yesh Atid, according to polls, is actually growing. While they certainly have said that they wouldn't sit with Netanyahu, they could certainly sit with Likud in the future. They've sat with Likud, the same with Yisrael Beitenu. Yisrael Beitenu have probably more of a problem with the ultra-Orthodox parties. Yamina, in a post-Netanyahu scenario, could certainly find itself back in the government. New Hope, which is polling very close to the electoral threshold. It remains to be seen. A lot of these parties may, return in some way to the Likud, especially in a post-Netanyahu scenario. The parties on the left, the far left, Meretz, Labour, probably, at the moment, the majority of Israelis are voting for right-wing parties. So it's unlikely that they'll necessarily be in a future government, and Ram as well, although Ram, again, could be game changers, as they have been this time. They discussed with Netanyahu to form a government with them, serious talks. In the end, they decided to go with the current government. So at the moment, it remains to be seen. There are so many factors. As I said, elections are not in the offing. It all depends what happens in the next few months. If there's some achievement, success, Bennett was going in the wrong direction in polls. And then there was a poll last week which saw him double his current size. So one never knows exactly what's going to happen. 24 hours is a long time in Israeli politics, and a few months is certainly a long time. So it remains to be seen what happens in the months and certainly maybe even years ahead.
Thank you. So we have Marvin Clemell asked about, so I'm looking at an article from Al Jazeera right now saying Israeli settlers attacked village in occupied West Bank. Can you comment on this further? And then we have a follow-up question from an anonymous attendee asking how serious to the coalition is the Bar-Lev and Yamina MK's disagreement on this?
Yeah, so certainly, as I said, the ideological differences are coming, are being raised, if not daily, at least weekly. I don't know exactly what that article is. Obviously, I can't see it in front of me. Interestingly, I just saw, how many attacks there were. There's this idea, which is definitely being portrayed to the West, especially in the US, that settler attacks have increased, and they're the most problematic and potentially incendiary thing that's happening in West Bank, Judea, and Samaria. And actually, the facts are very different. The amount of settler or Israeli attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria has actually gone down this year, whereas the number of attacks on Israelis by Palestinians in the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria has actually gone up. There's thousands and thousands of attacks, but these attacks on a daily, we're talking about, I think, 4,000 this year. You can imagine they're not just daily, sometimes even hourly, whether they're rock attacks, whether they're Molotov cocktails, whether they're stabbing attempts, whether they're shooting attempts. These are happening on a regular basis, but they do not make the news, certainly not the international news, and do not make their way into foreign policy circles, whereas, many, if not most, settler attacks make headline news somewhere, not to justify any of them, but certainly the size and number of the two sides of it are certainly not equal, in any way, shape, or form. So I can't talk specifically about what the article talks about because I don't know that specific event, but certainly it's become a bit of an outsized nature. And Minister Bar-Lev's comments certainly riled a lot of people on the right because there was so much focus on the so-called settler attacks as opposed to the Palestinian attacks on settlers. And that certainly, it will continue. It's not a great threat to the government. They've been attacking each other in the media for quite a while, since the beginning in some way. And I think that will continue because there are differences, of opinions and ideologies, and I don't think that will stop. But if you look again at the leaders, you don't see the leaders on the whole attacking each other. Even the Gantz meeting with Mahmoud Abbas, you saw Zev Elkin, who's probably one of the most right-wing members of the coalition, a fellow cabinet minister to Bar-Lev. Even he, if you read his actual comments, he certainly condemned it, but not in personal terms. And he, sort of used language, this is not a meeting I would have held, this is not something, again, in very cautionary sort of terms. So I think that really shows that no one wants to, at that level. At the member of Knesset level, yes, there are attacks from one member of Knesset to another, one party to another. But at the higher levels, we see that they're not going too far. And I think that will continue.
Thank you. An anonymous attendee asks, regarding Iran and the serious threat to Israel, is there anything more that Israel can do to reduce the possibility of war? Can Israel make Iran understand Israel would prefer living in peace with the Iranian people?
Well, that makes a differentiation between Iran and the Iranian people. Israel has no beef with the Iranian people. It says it regularly, tries to reach out to the Iranian people and says, you're not our enemy. It's the Ayatollah led leadership, which is the one that's calling for the end of Israel. It's calling for the annihilation of Israel, to wipe it off its map. It's the sort of description that it puts on its missiles, as it goes through the streets of Tehran, the ballistic missile testing, which could reach all of Israel. That's the sort of bellicose nature which is coming out of Tehran. So I'm not sure, this isn't like with the moderate Sunni regimes. Iran is a theocracy. It is run by, there's a big debate exactly where the Ayatollahs are, how rational they are, how driven by religious ideology they are. What we've certainly seen this year is that the governments, which is basically handpicked by the Ayatollahs, are certainly more extreme and more hard line than the previous one, which was seen as, quote unquote, relatively moderate or pragmatic. So it's certainly a turn for the worse. Israel doesn't seek a war with Iran, but Israel also can't allow a nation, or let's say a leadership that says it's going to destroy the state of Israel to have the ability to do it. Jewish history in the not too recent past shows an example. When someone says they're going to destroy you, sometimes you have to sort of understand that there is that intention.
So you mentioned that the opportunity to act would be smaller if there was a deal on the table with Iran. Do you think that the US and the United Kingdom and France would support Israel if something were to happen that they would need to attack, even with a deal on the table?
If there's a deal on the table, then I don't think they would support them. If they felt that also Iran was getting closer and closer and on the threshold of becoming militarized nuclear state, then probably behind closed doors there'd be some sort of understanding for an attack. I don't think that Israel would not inform, especially the US, maybe at the last minute, maybe without the opportunity to do anything. But again, at this point, everything depends on Vienna. That's really, if there's an agreement, it changes the game. If there's not an agreement, which I think is less likely, then that also changes the game. But I think at the moment, the West, the US, France, and the UK certainly wouldn't give a green light for a major Israeli attack on Iran at this point in time.
Understood. Reuven Hawk asks, what are your thoughts about the apparent attempt by Turkey's Erdogan to improve relations with Israel? How should Israel respond?
It's an interesting one because we've seen that relationship go up and down. We've seen some terribly anti-Semitic comments, not just comments, actions. Hamas has a base in Turkey. According to some Israeli officials, it's even been a base to launch terror attacks, to fundraise for terrorist organizations. So it's not just about the comments, it's about the actions as well. But we have heard in recent weeks the language being toned down, and Erdogan openly saying that he would like better relations. Of course, he has to put in that caveat, as long as the Palestinian issue is dealt with, because he's long wanted to portray himself as the leader of the Palestinian cause. There was an interesting event with an organization of rabbis in Islamic lands that went to visit with him last week, and he said very positive things about Jews, about Israel. But again, I think we've dealt with this question before. And with Erdogan, as we've seen, at least from history, that he can say nice things one day and then the next day say something very different. So at the moment, things seem to be positive. There seems to be a relatively positive atmosphere. But, it remains to be seen. Some are tying it into the economic situation in Turkey, that he needs to play nice at this point. So we'll see what happens. Also, Turkey, I don't think, if I'm correct, is a million miles away from their own election season. And obviously Erdogan's favorability is going down, especially with the economic situation and the hyperinflation. So I think that we'll start to see a lot of rhetoric coming out dependent on where Erdogan sees his chances of re-election amongst his base.
All right. And to end on a slightly lighter note, do you think that Israel will be letting tourists into the country in the coming 2022?
Oh, yeah, I hope at some point, I hope we're not going to go a whole year without tourists. That would be a death knell to our tourism industry. It seems to be happening is that they're already starting to take more and more countries out of the red list, because there is this feeling Omicron is already in Israel. So why, hurt the tourism industry, the airline industry, if it's already come in. So more and more red countries formerly red countries are coming off the list. The US, the UK, and Canada are still there. There's talk of possibly even in a week they're coming off. Tourists may well come soon after that, perhaps for the fully vaccinated. Interestingly enough, there is more and more talk. I've actually been hearing it for a couple of weeks, and there seems to be more and more talk, even openly, that the Omicron, in some medical circles in Israel, are saying that it could be the greatest blessing because Omicron is seen to be highly contagious, but not especially deadly, especially compared with the Delta and even the original virus. So some are suggesting that maybe this is the opportunity to go for herd immunity, especially in a vaccinated population, which, again, the vaccines are less effective in transmission, but certainly still remain effective in preventing serious illness. And with the drugs that Pfizer are delivering a treatment, it could be, and again, I say this with a great caveat, but I'm hearing it more and more, that there are voices who are saying, we're not going to go to lockdown anymore, to just have this full cycle of just locking down every few months and then coming up and then closing the airports and then this, that maybe it's worth just letting Omicron go around in a vaccinated population, pushing the vaccine still, and then maybe there'll be some sort of herd immunity. I don't know. I'm not an expert. Don't take anything I've said, but I'm just telling you what it is starting to be talked about behind closed doors and even now a little bit publicly. So I'm optimistic. There's a lot of optimism, especially when you look at what happened in South Africa, which was the ground zero for the Omicron, and now the numbers are getting much, much better. So there is a certain amount of optimism in the long term for the Omicron mutation, but like all things, we've been proven wrong so many times with the coronavirus, so remains to be seen. So I hope tourists are coming back as soon as possible, and things seem to be moving in that direction, but remains to be seen.
All right, well, that seems like a good place to end our last webinar of 2021. We've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you so much for taking time to update us. For our viewers and listeners, we will not be having a webinar on Friday. We wish you a safe and healthy, happy new year. Have a good one.